But I so appreciate seeing you all and seeing so many familiar faces. I sort of have a feeling that this meeting is sort of a watershed meeting. We haven't been together for a long time. And I've been absent from many of your meetings because I've been working on a book for 27 years. And the last 10 or 15 years, I've been really isolating myself to see if I couldn't get it done in this century. And I just finished it recently, and I'm doing the index, and it will probably be out by about the 15th of March. And it's called The Majesty of God's Law. Now, this is the material that the founders kept talking about and were never able to adopt because the country wasn't ripe for it. Jefferson said we can't adopt God's law in place of English common law until we have a virtuous people. And we don't have one yet. And we have to wait until the country has been organized the way God wanted it organized under God's law. And that's not done yet. And he had 2 or 3 other things. He said it's going to happen. We've got to have Bible Christianity restored. It's going to be in this country, but I don't think it'll be in my time. You can't live God's law until that's happened. So they listed all these things why they couldn't adopt it, and then went ahead and told us how to put it into operation. It's a fantastic story. I didn't get it in school. I didn't get it in law school. It was hidden back in their correspondence. I couldn't believe it when Jefferson wrote to John Adams. They're both old men by this time, old political enemies. They're both agreed that the great moment spoken of by Moses is going to come, and we will live God's law in America. Now, when I found out about this, it was from a man who said, you know, our country isn't getting prepared for this great opportunity. And it will come in a time of crisis. And there won't be any time to do any homework. And he was very cross with the attorneys. He said, you know, people won't know where to go to find out what to do. And they'll come to you fellows, and you don't know anything. And he was cross with them. So when they had left, I said, I don't know what you're talking about. Where would we go to find out how to function in this time of crisis that you talk about? He said, the founders knew. I said, that's my specialty. I've never heard them talk about this. They knew. They knew it was coming down, and they knew how to build it back up. There's a crisis coming, and nobody's getting ready for it. And that dear man died a year and a half later. And by the time of his passing, I had found it. It was in the correspondence of these men, and they had it all figured out what would happen when America hits a crisis that's coming. So,
Brother Cleon,
yes.
what's the man you're speaking of in 1927?
His name was David O. McKay. Familiar to some of you. And the lawyers he was bawling out were church lawyers. And he said, you know, they come to Ezra Taft Benson not because he's an apostle, but because he knows agriculture. They're not going to come to any church. They're going to come to you lawyers that are supposed to know the answers. And you don't know anything. He was cross. And he said, I've been trying to get you to do this for a long time. And you don't do it. Anyway, this is my wife's formula when you have a winter cold and get a little coughing spasm. And it consists of vinegar and honey and cayenne pepper. And so she says, you put that where it's close and handy, because sometimes you get a little coughing spell, and I might. So here we go. When I first got going on this project, I found that there were certain principles that the founders said you cannot survive as a free people if you do not respect these indispensable principles. Then they'd mention another one, and another one. And I thought, I ought to be writing these down. So I did, and I got to 28, and then I ran out and they started repeating themselves. So I wrote my first book in this field called The 5,000-Year Leap. And I took all 28 of those principles and outlined what they said were indispensable. They have been shredded. Practically none of them are left. They've either been neglected or methodically destroyed. Now, these principles belong to all of us, of all faiths. They don't belong to any particular church. And before I'm through, you'll see how the founders felt about religion per se, and why it was so important that we all rally together and enjoy the good Bible and the scriptures and love one another and live the principles. That was very important to the founders if we want to survive. So after I'd finished this one, I said, now, we really need to take each of the principles in the Constitution apart and see why the founders put it in the Constitution. There are 248 principles in the Constitution they wrote. We now have 286 principles, and not all of them are good. And so in our book, what we did was to take each principle, why the founders said it was important. It has a number, and we have what they said about it. And then after they died, we didn't have any more principles added until the Civil War. And then they added a few more. And not all of them are good. And in this conference, you'll hear why some of them eventually have to be eliminated. But anyway, there they are, all numbered with what the founders said about them, why they're important. And we called it The Making of America. When that came out, there were certain people that said that book has got to be destroyed. And the people for the American way were among the foremost. And when they found out that the Bicentennial Commission of California had recommended this book for all the schools of California, they spent a large amount of money donating to the members of the California legislature to have the whole Bicentennial Commission of California dissolved and this canceled. It was kind of amazing. First thing I know, I'm on the Today Show, and they're holding up this book, and millions of people saw it who'd never seen it before, and the sales went up. You have to have a controversial book these days. And do you know why they objected to this book? Because I quoted an economic Pulitzer Prize-winning economist who said, you know, back in the days down south, we've got a lot of stories, but some of those families did more for their blacks than when they were freed and sent up north. And sometimes those mothers get right out there and work in the field, and they'd nurse a little pickaninny when it was hungry and the mother wasn't there. The word pickaninny, that's the one. That's a racist term. And so Dr. Allen of California called a press conference. He's black. He's one of the great scholars. Later became commissioner of civil rights for the Department of Justice. He called, and there were about 25 leading newspapers and television people in that meeting. He says, Pickaninny has been used for 400 years as a word of affection for our little people. And anybody that says that's racist is a racist. He's a racist for saying he's a racist. That's our word. And they're trying to destroy it. I thought there'd be a real big flurry in the press. Not one word. Isn't that interesting? Not one word. So anyway, that was the second book. And then I said, there's a third book that we need to eventually finish. And that's the one I had started in 1967. The Majesty of God's Law. Now the reason it's important is because the Founding Father says someday we're going to live under God's law. I had a call recently. I'll try all this. That's too good to be legal. Man called me and he said, "What is God's law?" I said, "It's a system of structured liberty." Well, he said, the liberty part I like. I'm worried about the structure. I said, it's the only system of law ever revealed by God. And it's a way that you can live happily, with prosperity, no crime, no poverty, if you practice its principles. It's just beautiful. Well, how elaborate is it? I said, it has about 100 rules. What do you mean 100? I said, they're more valuable than all the laws in every library in the United States. And you can raise up a great people and a happy people, a prosperous people, peaceful people with these 100 propositions, providing you carry out the book of instructions that go with it. That's what's taking me so long. Amazing. I got the book of instructions and carefully analyzed them. Founders didn't have them all figured out. There were some problems they didn't quite. They said, don't see how that applies quite. So I worked at it and found it right in the Bible, but way over further, where Ezra said, this is the way we did this. Oh, I said, that's the answer. The founders didn't quite get it in Ezra, so, you keep studying till, and there were a lot of other problems. But anyway, after 27 years, it's our best. Someone else may do it a lot better, I don't know. But it's our effort to share with you our very best thinking about the coming order of God's law. It's coming to America. Now, it'll come under circumstances that are a bit of a trial, because it will come after a cleansing. And I know we're all concerned about what's happening to our country, but it was planned to be this way. And that came as a great shock to me, that anybody would plan it. But Alexis de Tocqueville came over to America in 1831. He knew more about America and how it operated and its genius than almost anybody then living. He spent a couple of years here, not quite, almost. He talked to everybody, got out in the hinterlands, and he went and wrote a 2-volume work called Democracy in America. And you'd love to read the first volume, because it says how great we're going to be, the most powerful, wealthy, strong nation in the world. The second volume you won't like, and that's where he says it will all come unraveled. And it will be done by your most successful, wealthy people. And they will try to remake it and do it over again because they don't like what the founders did. And it will be a disaster because they will reverse most of the things that made America great, that made them rich. So, I have it all in the book, what happened. We did become the greatest industrial nation in the world by about 1903, 4, or 5. Then we went into a very terrible depression in 1907 and 8. Part of it was caused by these very men. They kept meddling with the system, and every time they did, you'd get a depression, but they set it up that way. And they would agree there should be a depression. They'd confiscate a lot of homes and farms. It's a pretty evil story, and it's told by one of our foremost economists in his analysis of the Great Depression of 1927. He goes back, he said, this is the same thing. They've done it over and over to us. And it's time we awakened. Well, this is de Tocqueville talking. Your people who took advantage of the system and were the most successful will decide in their own egotistical arrogance to phase out the Constitution or ignore it and set up a new system. And they began in 1908 to meet together. Now these aren't pollywogs. These are big fish. One is the father of American steel. And he came over to the United States as just a pauper from Scotland. And then he got in, he worked hard, and any money he could get, he'd invest. And he ends up with more money when he wanted to retire than anybody could raise on Wall Street. They had to pool all their resources in order to take care of him and let him retire. We had another one who was the richest man on Wall Street. I'm talking about J.P. Morgan, first Carnegie and then J.P. Morgan, and we'll get to John D. Rockefeller. These were the real three main planners for a new Constitution. We've got the minutes of their meetings. We got them about 1948 in a congressional hearing. We got them accidentally. I've got the whole story right here. I've got the quotation from their minutes. And they're going to do 8 things. They're going to get us a new money system. We're going to get off of gold and silver. They're going to capture the White House and the State Department. They're going to collectivize and control all the means of production and distribution. Here are men who have been the major disciples and advocates of American free enterprise that now want to concentrate control over all the corporations, all the production of food, over wages and so forth, and then have the government that they will control supervise it. That was a big operation that they set up. Nobody really knew what was going on. And in 8 years, they had accomplished everything that they wanted to achieve. Let me just read it to you. They had their own man, Woodrow Wilson, elected President of the United States. They originally went to the man who was currently president, but he didn't want anything to do with this. He said, I think this would be a big mistake, don't do it. So they started looking around for their own president. And there was a man who was head of Princeton University named Woodrow Wilson. Written a history of the United States, had been very critical of the system. He said there's not enough strength. We ought to be able to do something. And he said we ought to have somebody like J.P. Morgan in there. We had a dozen people like J.P. Morgan. We wouldn't have these problems. Oh, they liked him. And so they cultivated him and gave him a lot of money, and they elected him governor of New Jersey. Princeton, New Jersey. And then they built him up So that by 1912, they were able to offer him as president for the Democratic Party. The Republicans already had their president in power, and they were going to re-elect him. So they did a neat thing. They went to Teddy Roosevelt, who'd already served as president, and said, Teddy, you ought to be the president. Oh, you think so? Really? If you knew Teddy, you knew how to get to him. We'll give you the money to run as an independent. Well, what did he do? He split the Republican Party. Guess who got in? Woodrow Wilson as president. Now, I've studied Woodrow Wilson very carefully because he took with him when he went in Colonel House, who actually represented Wall Street and some of the big banking firms of Europe. And he guided Woodrow Wilson right along. And I can't believe Woodrow Wilson keeps warning people about the big secret power that everybody is scared of here in the United States. These are quotes from his books. And he's still saying it clear up to 1920. He said, I don't know who they are, but everybody's so scared of them. Well, they were the people he was working for. And he wasn't the only one. A good friend of ours was also working for them and thought they were doing a great job. And I'll tell you who he was in just a minute. But anyway, within 8 years, here's what they had. They had their own man, Woodrow Wilson, elected president of the United States by inducing former President Theodore Roosevelt to run as an independent and thereby split the Republican vote. So the Democratic candidate won. 2, they had bypassed the Constitution and set up the Federal Reserve System with a consortium of private banks issuing the official currency for the United States government and controlling both the supply of money and the interest rates. 3, they had reversed the position of the Constitution and the Founding Fathers by passing an amendment, the 16th, which authorized a direct taxation of private incomes as well as corporate profits. Guess who sponsored that bill? The Republicans. Isn't that interesting? In this book, the second book, we took every one of the amendments and who sponsored them and how they got in there and what they did to it. Why the Republicans? That's an interesting story. They had they changed the Constitution by passing an amendment, the 17th, which required U.S. senators to be elected by popular vote rather than by appointment of the state legislatures, which the founders had provided in order to have the Senate protect the states' rights and otherwise frustrate the more radical legislation emanating from the House of Representatives. These men in their minutes say that we've got to get rid of the power of the Senate to keep nullifying this collectivist program that we can popularize through the House of Representatives. We've got to take their power away from them. Well, how will we do that? Who do that? We'll get them elected like congressmen. And they'll have to go out to get elected by promising the same thing. Isn't that what's happened? They can't stand up against the House of Representatives and say, we don't want that money out in Utah to take over our schools or to do this or to do that. We just don't want. The Senate used to be able to do that, and they kept wiping out a lot of this liberal legislation that these men had planned to put through. And then they had used the controlled corporate media to inflame the nation into participating in a European war just 6 weeks after Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated for his second term after being elected for keeping us out of the European war. Now, what they achieved in 8 years is fantastic. And as I go back and study the history of it, I keep saying to myself, how could they do it? Why would people go for it? Well, we're doing a lot of the same thing right now. It's amazing how they can manipulate enough of the media onto their side until that's all you hear, and you say, well, guess it must be good. So everybody goes for it. Now they came to their crisis. This is important. The whole purpose of this little group of rich men was not to just socialize America. but eventually use it as the base for financing the taking over of the world and having it all socialized and having a great new world order. They didn't use those terms. That came a little later, but that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a world system. And the Constitution, of course, didn't set things up that way. So the Constitution has to go. The amazing thing to me is that these men often gave speeches praising the great American system by which they had become billionaires. Now they're saying, but we mustn't allow it to continue any longer. So this thing was going on and on without anybody really knowing what was happening. But the lawyer they had hired to set up the American International Corporation. See, they knew that a war was coming because they themselves planned it. They were in on the planning of it. And they knew that eventually they'd get us into the war. Why do they want us in a war? After a year of study in 1908 to 1909, they decided that it would be so repulsive to Americans to suddenly see everything being collectivized into a socialist structure, they would virtually revolt unless we were in a war and it was done as a matter of emergency. And so the next thing we knew, we elected a president who kept us out of the war. And then you have him all of a sudden getting the media behind him and say, you know, we got to have freedom of the seas. Those U-boats are beginning to attack our ships. We ought to get out there and declare war. And that's the way we went. So by 1917, we're in the war. And when it was won, and it was much worse than anybody had imagined, the deaths and the ravaging of the earth in that war was just terrible. But it was all over, and so they introduced the League of Nations. Now we're going for the New World Order. And they've got a lawyer that they had hired to set up the American International Corporation who decided this is far enough. We're not going to have a League of Nations. So he wrote the speeches for all the senators, or a number of the senators. The real powerful speeches were written by this lawyer. And we defeated the League of Nations. The Senate did not adopt it. It was the first monkey wrench in the entire plan of these wealthy men to change the nation. And they were so frustrated. So they said, well, we've got to maintain continuity. And so they set up the Council on Foreign Relations to sort of carry it on. Meanwhile, they didn't know who did it to them. It was their lawyer. And he himself had thought up to now it was a pretty good deal. And these big corporations they'd set up, they'd purchased copper mines and ships. You can't believe what they had bought for this big corporation. And he thought that was a great way to spread the American system, the American idea. But when it comes to a League of Nations, no. So he used all his talent to get it defeated. And of course, they didn't know who wrote those speeches. He never caught on to what they were doing until 1923, when he saw them sit down and say what we've got to do to get another world war. That's 1923. This man's name is J. Reuben Clark. Isn't that interesting? So when he saw that they were out to destroy the Constitution, set up a world order, he was invited to speak in Salt Lake City at a general conference. He thought, this is my chance. I will pull the plug on these boys. So what did he come? He didn't expose them. He gave a talk on the Constitution and the necessity of preserving it. And you know what people in Utah said? That was kind of a boring speech. Well, if you've ever heard J. Reuben Clark speak, it's easy for him to be boring. because he takes every word and measures it on all four sides, weighs it, and he says it. This is why he was such a great attorney, but it didn't go over very well, and he was so disappointed, he went back and became Under-Secretary of State. He said, maybe I can do some good here. And pretty soon they made him ambassador to Mexico. And he was right in the middle of going up through the diplomatic corps when all of a sudden an elderly gentleman here in Salt Lake asked him to come and be his counselor. It wasn't to be an apostle, just a counselor. So he responded and came, and he, first thing you know, he's telling bishops and stake presidents what to do. He doesn't know anything about it. He's never been a bishop. He's never been a stake president. He's practically been out of the church for 30 years because there was no place to meet. He said to President Grant, I thought you made these appointments by inspiration. And President Grant said, we do. He said, then what am I doing here talking to bishops and stake presidents when I've never been one? Well, that's not why you were appointed. Oh, why was I appointed? Because God is very concerned about the destruction of the Constitution that's going on in Washington, and the people are to be awakened, to be alerted, and the whole nation realize that the Constitution is in jeopardy. That's your assignment. Oh, he was excited because he was one of the finest constitutionalists in the whole nation. So he started giving those talks. I got every one of them. Oh, they'll just bore you to death. He tells all about the Justinian Code and the Theodosian Code and the origin of all of these principles. And it goes on and on and on. And for me, in law school, studying the Constitution, it was the best material I could get. And Dr. Compton at the George Washington University Law School used to compliment me for my insights. In all honesty, I should have told him, but I didn't. Anyway, it was about that time. See, we're in the 30s now. And we get up to 1936, and the Supreme Court had been throwing out the New Deal right and left, and all of a sudden they reversed themselves. And they expressed an opinion. It's a strange kind of thing the Supreme Court is allowed to do. It has nothing to do with the case that's in front of it. And they had the Butler case before them. And in their announcement, they said, we're no longer going to require the Congress to appropriate money for the general welfare. They can do it for private welfare, too, if they think that it's for the general well-being of the nation. At that time, our debt was $8 billion, a national debt, and everybody was pretty concerned about $8 billion. Every congressman went home, excuse me, better than I thought it was going to be, and they figured out plans to bring to Congress to appropriate money that they could argue in the final analysis was for the good of the country. And we've got to help the farmers. See, under the Constitution, you can't have money collected from everybody and then spend it for just somebody. All of the laws had to be for the whole country. That's why it says the Congress can only spend money for national defense and the general welfare. And anything that didn't cover everybody was out. You couldn't appropriate money for farmers or a disaster area. You couldn't appropriate any private welfare. Boy, do you know that we went from $8 billion in debt in 1936 to $800 billion in debt by 1980. Now we're up to $5 trillion. And the big argument going on back in Washington is whether we should raise the ceiling and borrow a little more. We're up to $5 trillion, got to borrow some more. Republicans say, well, don't borrow so much. And the Democrats say, we have to keep all these entitlements going. No, the Republicans say, let's cut it back a little bit, so that in about 7 years we would balance the budget. Senator Hatch said, I was elected to cut. And I'm not being allowed to do it because they're all going for just not borrowing quite so much. That's supposed to be a great thing. He said, we are in real trouble with the kind of thinking that's going on in Washington. Now, just as a passing thought, because I have to hurry along here, the only thing that would really stop us from borrowing money would be to have Japan and Europe and Singapore, which has just gold in their banks, suddenly say, you know, we're not going to buy any more of those U.S. bonds. Hey, do you realize they're up to $5 trillion? And of course, they're paying $300 billion every year in interest, which is nice. But I think they're going to come unraveled. I don't think we'll buy any more of those U.S. bonds. That's all you'd have to have happen. Because we're out of money in Washington, aren't we? Yeah, we're out of money. And all we're quarreling about is whether or not we put the ceiling up a little higher. And the Republicans say, no, not quite that high. Oh, that's heroic. And the Democrats say, oh yeah, all the way, way up there. We've been doing it for 2 generations, which they have. Anyway, got to do that for the poor and for the senior citizens. And they just make you cry when they say what's going to happen to everybody, you know. Little children starving to death, no breakfast. Ooh, they just really put it on. I turn on CNN sometimes and it just makes me regurgitate. But anyway. People want to know where we are. This is where we are. Now you say, that's kind of gloom and doom, Dr. Skousen. I said, yes. It's the storm before the breaking of a new age. A great new age is coming. Founders knew it. I have a whole chapter. This came as a great shock to me. I have a whole chapter where the founding fathers predicted that we would get to this stage. And I quote quite a bit of de Tocqueville, who said, and this is the way they'll get you. This is the way you'll lose your freedom. And they're going to tie you up so tight you won't know where you are. Until finally you have a cleansing. Then you can start all over again and do it right. That's coming. I don't know when. But I had a minister call me recently and say, Dr. Skousen, do you believe the Bible? And I said, yes. He said, do you believe in prophecy? And I said, yes. He said, do you know that it predicts that before the end of the 6th seal there'll be a tremendous earthquake? I said, yes, Revelations chapter 6. He said, what impresses you about prophecy when you read it? And I said, the fact that everyone came to pass literally. He said, and that worries me. And I said, well, it would change everything. It would really change things. He said, are you worried? And I said, no. He said, why? I said, on account of God's insurance policy. Oh, is there an insurance policy? Yes. I said, have you ever read in Deuteronomy about the blessings and the cursings? Oh, sure. And do you notice how you get the blessings? You don't do it by aborting 30 million children in the womb in one generation, which is about what our score is going to be. You don't do it by having the youth so actively involved in immorality. They're having babies at the age of 13 and so forth. You don't have it by having kids so ignorant that when they get out of high school, they can't even read their diplomas. Great country isn't built that way. Well, he said, then how do you get an insurance policy out of all of that? The blessings are guaranteed to those who try and who obey the commandments of God and love Him and stay with Him in spite of all of this terrible Sodom and Gomorrah stuff going on. I never thought I would live to see in the state of Utah a group of youth wanting to organize a club for gays or homosexuals. The Homosexual Act happens to be a violation of the law in practically all of the states. But it's become institutionalized by an act of the Supreme Court that says you can't do anything prejudicial to a person just because they have a different lifestyle. That's not a different lifestyle. That's a wicked lifestyle. That's a Sodom and Gomorrah lifestyle. It's a disease-ridden, dirty lifestyle. It's become tolerated. We've outlawed God from our schools. We tear the Ten Commandments down off the wall because you can't mix religion and have the children exposed to those terrible ideas. Our Supreme Court did this, and it was predicted by Jefferson. He said the greatest enemy of the Constitution of the United States is the Supreme Court, because you'll have 5 out of 9 men vote to destroy the country and there is no appeal. They're not accountable, they're not elected. He roasted the Supreme Court in his own lifetime very quickly. Because the founders knew this was happening, they spent a lot of time telling us what to do to set it back up again. And I rejoice in their insights, in their wisdom, in their capacity to see what our lives would be like and how we could straighten them out. And so, what I tried to do in this book was to set up the best I could what they said to do. It's pretty exciting. We'll go back to the original Constitution. You see, when we're cleansed, it won't matter whether it's an earthquake or whether it's a plague, they're afraid of that. It won't matter what it is. God has always said, trust me. If you're staying close to me, I will preserve the remnant that will be able to build it back up. That's what we all ought to be striving to do in our families. Stay close to the Lord. Talk to Him. Pray to Him. And do what He says to do to live clean, honest, wholesome, good neighbor lives. That's our assignment. And then, if you don't keep up your insurance policy, you get the cursings. And there isn't anything that you can think of that's so terrible that isn't listed there. So, I mean, that's no option. That's no alternative. And those of you who have a Doctrine and Covenants, you might just check 97 and 25, and that there's a repeat of the insurance policy. And if you get behind on your premium, try 26. You won't like that. And that's where it describes the cleansing coming in part by scourges, plagues. Now we have the plagues all wrapped up out here in Tooele. I guess you knew that. All the terrible things that could happen to the whole world are wrapped up out here. I don't know whether you saw the movie The Outbreak or not. But when some of those little things get away, they were even contemplating roping off about 25,000 people that all had it, and then just dropping a bomb and wiping them out. Then fortunately, before the end of it, they worked out they had a monkey that had developed an immune, what do we call it? Anyway, It was a mutation, anyway, that made it possible to curse. So they didn't have to kill the people, and so it ends up all right. And the boy marries the girl, and you know how those go. But these plagues are very real. And so I take Deuteronomy, or 97 and 25, and I say, now, it's coming, and let's stand in the right place and do the right things. We're going to be all right. Now, the first thing that happens in the cleansing, I'll do this very quickly, is we set up what Daniel saw in the 2nd chapter as the kingdom of God. And it's not called the United States, it's called the kingdom of God. Brigham Young knew a lot about that kingdom. And he said, I want to say something to our people. He said, here we are out here in the mountains, and we're out here because we were driven here. We didn't want to be here, but we're not going to stay isolated. We're going to invite a lot of people in, and we're going to make them feel at home. We're going to have a happy time together with people of all faiths. And he said, if you think that people have to be LDS in order to belong to the kingdom of God, you are egregiously wrong. To belong to the kingdom of God, the knee must bow and accept the Christ, and there must be a willingness to obey his commandments, and then I hail them as a brother. Whether he's Episcopalian or Catholic or whatever he is, he's a brother. And in the kingdom of God, we'll be organized into wards. These are secular wards. We know a little bit about wards, but we're not talking about our kind of wards. These are secular wards. And the people are organized by families into 10 families. 5 of those are organized into 50 families. And 2 of those 50s are organized into 100 families. And that was the community set up by Moses in Deuteronomy 1st chapter. And the founders keep talking about Deuteronomy 1st chapter. That's where we're going to do it. How do you elect a leader? How would you like to elect President of the United States? Just the way the Constitution says to do it. And our people don't know. How do you do it? You don't go for Democrats or Republicans. And you don't go for a third party. How do you do it? You don't elect the president yourself. You choose somebody that you really trust, has had a lot of experience. Moses described the kind of people you choose. And they go and interview those who have been put forward as possible candidates. And they get their background, they ask them the questions, and after they've talked to all of them, each one of those electors votes independently. They send their votes into the Congress, and that's where they're opened and counted. Oh, what a surprise. Who's that man anyway? Well, you see, you might not even know the man that's elected. Because the men that you chose to do the investigating and the checking are going to choose the ones that were the very best in the country. When this was done the first time, guess who was elected? Guess who was elected? Unanimously. Every one of those people that had been chosen by their neighbors to go out and choose the best possible person, they chose George Washington. Isn't that pretty good? He didn't want to be chosen. So they came to him and said, now, President, we want you to allow us to put your name in. Oh, no, I'm retired. Oh, boy, I've had, I want a little rest. For the sake of your civic duty, you do it. We're not going to put it that way, are you? Yes, we are. Well, okay, go ahead then. And they did, and he was elected. And that was the way it was going to be. But the party system started in 1800 because Senator Hamilton was setting out to make the Federalist Party really a monarchist party. He'd already gotten a national bank going, privately owned national bank. He got that going. By 1798, he said, I made a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. But it was already in. It would be in for 20 years. You're going to hear more about these banking programs. This is a European type of bank. This is not an American bank. National central banks are not American. That's a Rothschild, Bank of England type of concept. Not what Jefferson would have called an American bank. So finally Jefferson said, I'm going to run against this crowd. And I want to get all Americans who really believe in the Constitution to come together. So I'm going to call my party the Democratic Republican Party. Now, if that isn't brilliant. And we're going to campaign against the monarchists. They're trying to set it up, make a king out of our president. So he won. We've never recovered from the party system from that day to this. Washington, in his farewell address, said the majority will elect a party, and the ones who are now out of power will do everything possible. He didn't mention it, but it included lying, deception, in order to get back in power and to prevent the ones that were elected by the majority from doing the job they were elected to do. If you don't believe it, just turn on TV and watch them. It's there. Well, they give me my big sign here now, and so I just want to go quickly now. We will have a new system of law. We will have a new system of government. We'll have a restoration of the Constitution. And we'll be organized into secular wards. And everybody belongs to a family. If they don't, they join a family. If they belong to some family. There will be none of this people in the streets. There will be no more of these homeless, faceless people in the big cities. We'll be completely organized in a wonderful, wonderful way. And nearly all of our problems will be solved in each ward by people we elect. And Brigham says, I want you LDS to get used to the fact that some of our best leaders will not be LDS, but you'll love them. And you'll support them. And we'll live happily together. So you'll notice that in Salt Lake City, this is the new mood. No, I shouldn't say the new mood. It really was, in a sense, always the mood, but it's become more apparent, I think, in recent years. So in National Geographic for January just picked up on this very spirit. They describe how, as they went around Salt Lake City, it was kind of remarkable how everybody kind of feels happy about everybody else. He said, we went to the Catholic Cathedral, and its big, beautiful windows were done by wealthy LDS people. And we go over to the Episcopal Church. It's having its big convention here now. And guess what they say? Everything all of us believe in who are Christians have hope for the future. Isn't that great? And they picked up on that, and they put it in their magazine, and that of all the places they'd been here, it seemed like there was a congenial spirit developing on an ecumenical basis, nobody trying to downrate somebody else because they belong to a different church. That's just the way it ought to be. And in the New Jerusalem, that's the way it'll be. So I tried to put all those things together in one book. After we've had a chance to kind of read this book, I'll be very appreciative of your suggestions, observations, because it really is what the founder said we're supposed to do in this coming period. So what do we do now? We find out about what we're supposed to do. And you'll like it. It'll be a happy life. And to the extent that you can do it in your own families, do it now. And I've got a whole chapter on that. What can I do now? Well, things that you can do it because there's happiness, there's security, and there's success. Not that we don't have trials, we will. But anyway, I count you people among the choice remnant. And you wouldn't be here if you weren't. And a lot of other people out there just like you. I want to have them kind of know what we're thinking, what we're doing. And encourage them to stand steady. Because there is an insurance policy for those who do. And there's not much promise for those who don't. So I thank you for coming. I thank you for being who you are. And I'm just glad that I count you as friends. God bless you all. Thank you very much.